Recently there has been a new interview from Wowhead with Brian Birmingham about the state of Wrath the Lich King and how they are thinking about moving things forwards. As part of the channel and keeping you up to date on everything Wrath the Lich King related, I thought today we could go over it and have a bit of a talk about what was discussed. We have a lot of new info coming out about what they want to do and their design decisions, so let's go into it. We're going to start off with the ever-present talk about Dungeon Finder. They say our goal is to provide a tool that makes it easy to find groups without sacrificing human-to-human interaction. Looking first at the modern tools, we like the inviting and streamlined UI flow that helps you find the activity you're looking for. We also think it makes sense to declare your role in the group. He goes on to say the biggest problem with the Burning Crusades tool is that it's just not widely used. So we'd like to make it more enticing by streamlining its interface or adding an incentive to try it. I think the thing I like least about the current iteration of the Dungeon Finder is the spam and having to look for other people. There's not much going on when you're just watching a screen of spam flying past you. Also, in regards to people not using it at the moment, that's because the bulletin board add-on exists. I've said it before and I'll say it again, they're clearly intent on changing this and I will see what they will do in the beta, but I'd rather they stay on the side of using the LFD as it was in Wrath if they cannot find something that feels as though it works today in Classic. Next, on race and faction changes, this is the most confusing bit for me. So they say we saw a lot of interest from the role-playing community with Classic's original launch, and part of the draw for that audience is your experiences feel consistent with the world you're in. Fantasy races are dramatically different species, and while it makes sense for a giant tauren can stun you with a stomp of their hoof on the ground, and a tiny gnome can wiggle free from entangling roots, there's no in-world reason why a tauren would be able to suddenly become a gnome or vice versa. Can anyone think of a certain trinket which already does that exact thing? Because it's magic. I don't think there has to be a reason why you can do this one way or the other. He also goes on to say they don't want to give everybody the same racials in Arena as it would stop certain interactions from being possible, and if instead they gave everybody the ability to choose their racial in Arena, it would interfere with your ability to predict and counter your opponent. We joked around with disallowing racial abilities entirely and having goblin referees that run onto the field and throw a red card if you use one. I mean, as for racials in Arena and balancing them, well, let's take a look at Shadowlands. Surely, after all this time has gone by, things are more balanced on the retail game. They've had years and years to get them in a good state. Oh wait, about 40% of players are Orc and nearly 80% of the Arena player base is Horde due to racials. Racials have always proven too impactful to balance easily. So do you just remove them from Arena then? It feels as though it's part of the Arena experience which has existed and it's just something that you play around. What about if you pick a racial and it had a little buff under your character so other people could see what racial you have? But then again, they might as well just give everybody every man for himself, or whatever they've called it nowadays, because that's clearly the most powerful racial going. On top of this, allowing faction change is going to push the player base more clearly to picking what's best for their preferred area of content. I feel as though people go on all the time about human and every man for himself being OP in Wrath, which is true, but that's for the PvP player base, which we've seen so far is a lot less than the PvE player base, and Horde are better at that with Berserking and Blood Fury. For me, it doesn't look as though this is a better option one way or the other, and it would probably be best just to leave things as they were in Wrath. It's funny really, because at the moment Blizzard have chosen to not include a cash shot feature in the game and they're getting grief for it. They literally just cannot win. Also, they say on the subject of restricting transfers between PvE and PvP servers and limiting PvP servers to a single faction per account, they're still talking about it and will have more to say soon. I feel they could very much relax these restrictions at this point too. I mean, sorry to say, there just aren't really any PvP servers anymore, bar a select few, and it would benefit more people overall. Next up, Wintergrasp on faction imbalanced servers, aka servers. So they say our current thought is that maybe we will have a backdoor of sorts to let you into Vault of Archivon if you don't currently control Wintergrasp, but the entry will cost some things so that you're still incentivized to compete, or to gain high stacks of tenacity, which was a buff given to players who were outnumbered in Wintergrasp to help them win. This would turn the majority of Wintergrasp you'd experience into a handful of mega OP players versus, well, the rest of you. So as of patch 3.2, which is Trial of the Crusader, Wintergrasp changed to a queue system of 120 versus 120 maximum. So on big servers, it would be less than 1% of the player base fighting for something that 100% of the player base can benefit from against like 20 or 30 giga overpowered players who might struggle to go on to put a raid together for Vault of Archivon. I don't know, the whole system just seems bad if I'm honest. And if there was a backdoor to the raid, there's still the vendors out the front for the Stonekeeper shards and so on. And there's faction guards absolutely everywhere. Do you just put a goblin smuggler at the back door who sells stuff for like 20% more than they would if you controlled the zone? And retail has bot AI as well. I use the word AI very lightly here for Battlegrounds. They could be ported over to WillE Classic to fill the gaps of missing players, so at least big servers get to play the game of Wintergrasp. Otherwise it's going to be you sitting on a wall doing nothing for 30 minutes if there's a back door. Nobody's going to compete, are they? You know what, people would probably hate this idea because you would have to play Wintergrasp or you'd lose to bots and people would find that inconvenient when they just want access to it all the time. Anyways, I just thought I'd throw it out there. Next, pre-nerf and post-nerf boss encounters in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. So when Brian was asked about whether they're considering this for the expansion, he says that wasn't as much the case with Wrath of the Lich King. There just weren't as many catch-up nerfs outside a few outliers. So you already know me, I had to go and check every single raid and boss as per the available patch notes. So Naxxramas, no boss changes to speak of, though there was the ability to skip directly to Safin KT, which was added in patch 3.3. I can see this one being added earlier. Eye of Eternity players actually get buffed. This goes for the Oculus 2 as the drakes begin to scale with your average item level. Sartharian's Lair, there was a few changes noted here as well, particularly with the drakes. Ulduar, the trash in the instance gets nerfed many times over as seen here. I think when people talk pre-nerf though, they're caring more about the bosses than the trash. But on a boss by boss basis, Flame Leviathan was nerfed several times from its health to its adds. Ignis underwent many changes and damage nerf to the encounters. Razor Scale had many nerfs, and at this point I went and looked through the rest of the bosses and literally everything in Ulduar was nerfed, from damage to health to abilities to adds. One interesting thing to note here is that all these nerfs were done through hotfixes in about a month or so duration after the raid released. There very much seems to be grounds here for a post-nerf and potentially insanely overtuned pre-nerf Ulduar. Let me know what you think about this and what you remember doing from Ulduar if you raided it week 1 or 2. It would be good to hear from people who did it back in the day. In fact, overall this raid has the most changes I've ever seen documented from a single instance by a considerable margin. Moving on to Trial of the Crusader, again, many hotfixes that took place around 1 month after the raid release. Here's the Beasts of Northrend changes for instance, and the faction champions all had a large portion of their damage nerfed, but let's be real, who wants a difficult faction champions fight? The rest of the encounters were largely unchanged, save for some bug nerfs. For ICC, Brian brings up the passive buff that was gradually added, saying instead of it being ramped up week upon week, that you can pick the amount of buff that you want, so you can more or less choose the difficulty of the raid. As for a boss by boss breakdown, again, much like the previous raids, there are many changes across many of the bosses. Plenty of them are bug fixes or changes to the encounters to prevent certain unintended ways of completing a fight, but there's certainly some pre and post nerf in there as well. All in all, this looks way more complicated to consider than pre and post nerf was for TBCs, where bosses just had more or less health and perhaps one ability removed. But hopefully Blizzard do consider and go back and have a look at pre and post nerf Wrath of the Lich King. Since now we have different difficulties for the content, players can already choose to some extent what level of challenge they are comfortable with. Regarding dual specialization, Brian confirms they are no longer considering any changes to how dual spec worked originally. People who want to play more than one spec, rejoice. I'm happy they've gone back on this. Dual spec feels like an easy win that they don't really need to touch to make it good. And finally, regarding PvP and Arena in Wrath Classic, they talked a lot about the Ring of Valor, as in which state to release it in. During Wrath of the Lich King, this arena was quite literally always a buggy RNG filled mess, and I don't remember people enjoying it too much at the time either. But all in all, they say they're still working on which version they want to release. And that is all the news at the moment. As always guys, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I will see you all in the next one very soon.